Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to our panel discussion today. My name is Marie-Laure Mexi. I'm a research fellow at the Albert Hirschman Center of Democracy, which is part of the Graduate Institute in Geneva, and also special advisor to the President of Greece. And I have a great pleasure to be joined today by the director of the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Professor Marie-Laure Salles. And we are very privileged and very honored to be joined by the Vice Chairman of BlackRock, Mr. Philipp Hildebrand, who is also responsible for sustainable investing. And the discussion today will explore the different aspects of sustainable investing, future and the current trajectories. So welcome, Mr. Hildebrand, Professor Salles. It's quite honored to host you at the Delphi Economic Forum. If I'm not mistaken, Mr. Hildebrand, this is your first time in Greece, right? Addressing the public
the first time in Delphi. The first time in the center of the universe, yes.
Okay, so the Financial Times have described Mr. Hildebrand as a thinker strategist with a mindset that is suitable for periods of economic turmoils. And this is a period that we are now actually going through and witnessing. So his insights are very valuable today. And I would like to start with a question on how do you see this correlation of three variables: war, the energy crisis, and inflation. How do you see this relationship evolving, actually?
I think, first of all, thank you very much for having me here on this beautiful day. I think they're all deeply interrelated. The way I see it, we came out of COVID through this restart, created supply constraints that were very significant, that drove up inflation. So quite a different dynamic from the inflation we knew in the 70s, where it was as a result of an overheating economy. Here it came out of supply constraints, and then on top of this, we now have a second big supply shock, which is generated by the war and its effect on energy prices. And that, of course, means supply shock on top of supply shock, and ultimately that means inflation goes higher and becomes more persistent. So I think when you look at the inflation story today, you have to look at it in the context of the restart post-COVID, the energy crisis caused by the war, and how all of this is interrelated. So I think they really are interrelated, and then that, of course, has big implications for the transition to a net zero world, which we can talk about later on.
And well, there has been a shift in academic and policy discourses, a shift from energy transition to energy security, correct? How do you see this shift evolving? I mean, is the current situation going to lead to an acceleration of the transition to net zero, or we are going to see a disastrous return to coal? What is your take on the developments? What is the optimistic, or what is the pessimistic scenarios?
I think to me, the sort of central scenario is, if you think about what's just happened from a transition perspective, or even from an economic perspective, two things have occurred. One is we have imposed, the world has imposed, the war has imposed a massive carbon tax on at least the European economy. And by the way, the dimension of this are in a way far beyond what any government would have been able to do in the short term. And secondly, we have very likely some stranded assets in the energy space, particularly in Russia. So I think when you take these two things together, you can pretty quickly see, when you look at it from an economic perspective, but also from a practical perspective, that this, at least in Europe, should lead to an acceleration of the transition, notwithstanding some of the short-term effects that there may be some substitution back, perhaps even in the most extreme case, to coal. But I think there's no question that the green premium has just disappeared by way of this tax. It is now very advantageous to develop and seek, invest in alternative energy sources. Europe needs to make this transition very rapidly. There is a timeline on it because of the war. So to me, at least from a European perspective, it is, on balance, it's an accelerant to the transition, not a hindrance. It's a bit of a different story for the US, and that's going to create some divergence dynamics, which are not going to be trivial to manage. But at least from a European perspective, it seems to me the base case is pretty clear.
Professor Salles, what is your take on these developments?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. Good afternoon to everybody. And I'm very much in line with the analysis, but I think we need to add another complexifying factor. The latest IPCC report says we have 3 years. There's a window, and it's actually extremely urgent in its tone. It says we have 3 years to act, otherwise actually we are turning from a world of risk to a world of total uncertainty, meaning that the climate change consequences are possibly so catastrophic that we cannot even envision the types of consequences because of the very complex wicked interconnections, food and water security issues generating migration issues, wars, social tensions, political and geopolitical consequences, a bit of what we've seen, but probably on a bigger scale. So the big question for me with the current war is that it might be actually eating up on the little time that we had left, in a sense. I totally agree that in the longer term, it's really definitely will push actually in the right direction, at least Europe. But if we have that divergence and the climate change issue is by nature a global one. So if we have that divergence, we might be losing somewhere what we're gaining on the other side. And in the altogether, we might be a bit late. We might be just beyond the cusp of timing that we have. So that's a bit the complexifying factor that I would add here.
Is it the same for all regions? Mr. Hildebrand, you have co-authored a research paper which has been recently published by BlackRock, where you describe a divergent kind of global energy transition. Is that right? A different pace of acceleration in relation to Europe, and in relation to the US. Can you take us through this argumentation, actually, in the analysis?
Sure. Well, in some ways it's quite straightforward. The US does not have a particular energy cost problem at the moment. And so when I talked about the green premium having moved significantly, that's a much more pronounced effect in Europe than it is in the US. So I think, again, in the kind of short-term impact is that this has to lead to an acceleration of the transition, which, by the way, is supported by policy in Europe. You look at the way the recovery fund is set up, you look at some of the public financing efforts, all of this is directed towards channeling capital into the transition. In the US, it's the short-term impact of it doesn't work the same way. On the other hand, as you rightly said, in a sense, we're facing a trade-off between the transition cost for an economy of moving towards a net zero world. And then if we don't do that, if we don't do it fast enough, we're going to have the physical cost that will manifest itself and impede on economic activity as it unfolds. And you can see this already. In the US, for instance, if you look at utility companies that operate in coastal areas where you have exposure to flooding, the cost of capital for those companies has increased relative to other ones that are not in coastal areas. And so the market is beginning, even if the initial impact here in the US is much less and we have this divergence, the market is still going to begin to price in some of these longer-term trends. And as you rightly said, the latest ICCP report tells you that we're probably tracking at the moment something more like 3 degrees than 1.5 degrees, which means we are going to inevitably get an increase of physical manifestation of climate change. And so I think the timing is differentiated when you look at it between the US and Europe of these latest events in the last few weeks and months. But I think the longer-term story is still there, that undeniably we will have to transition out of an economy that is principally fossil fueled.
But what are the political implications of that? I mean, how resilient is multilateralism in terms, if we have a divergent kind of transition, right, means that we cannot actually generate common responses to our global commitments to energy transition, right?
Well,
what are the political
you should answer
implications
this, but we
that
can do it through price mechanisms, which is now what's just happened through this effectively massive carbon tax, or it can be done through standards and another way. So it doesn't, you know, I think there's some very good academics who have shown that you can have different instruments, but you've probably done some work on this.
Now, I think that I would like to go back to the pricing, because I think that the pricing is indeed one of the key issues. And you're right that actually there has been some of that happening, in a sense, naturally from the war. But I think that if we want to avoid this kind of weird situation of we know where we need to go, and we know we need to go there fast, but because of the current context, we are not going there fast enough, which means that we will be paying the price.
Or in different ways. We're going there in different ways, right?
Yeah. So if we want to avoid that, there's probably an urgency to actually transform our pricing mechanisms in the shorter term with this view on the longer term impact of those kinds of energies versus the more resilient forms of energy. So how can we do this without indeed some form of international collaboration? And I agree that there are places where standards can play that role, but there is also a need for some political, in a sense, push in that direction if you're going to have that fast enough and efficiently enough. And indeed, so going back to your question, Maria, on multilateralism, something that is very, very clear, you feel it, I mean, in the walls of Geneva all around, that there's really a major question as to what is the future of what I like to call the American century multilateral system. So where are we going? Are we, we do need, and we will still have standard making mechanisms, including partly private ones, or at least ones where you have private actors involved, etc. I think that will remain, but we need also political arenas that function and cross the different parts of the world, which right now, obviously, through tectonic shifts, are moving apart from each other. That's quite obvious. But that needs to be reinvented. And most people are just are really at a loss at this stage on what kind of reinvention this will imply.
And talking about multilateralism, in relation to what? What is the current stage of globalization we're experiencing, Mr. Hildebrand, now? Is it the end of globalization? Because there are those that argue that we are now witnessing the end of globalization per se, or the end of globalization as we know it, meaning that we are entering into a new era of globalization, probably a kind of fragmented globalization, which sounds a little bit of oxymoron, but meaning that we are going to have different economic blocks and different kinds of, supply chains. And there's all this discussion that, okay, with the pandemic, we didn't have a lot of reshoring, but now we are going to have a kind of friend-shoring, meaning reorienting strategic dependence towards alliance. And the US and the EU alliance to reduce strategic dependence, energy dependence on Russia is a kind of friend-sharing, restructuring of supply chains. What is your take on these developments?
Well, it's a very, I think, perhaps the most important question. If we look at the facts first, so Europe has a trade balance with China of 800 billion, the US has 600 billion, so it's not like we have no globalization. If you look at the data, which is always a good thing when we discuss these things, what the data tells you is globalization, at least measured by, let's say, global trade over global GDP, has basically peaked in around 2007. And what we've seen since, it's been quite volatile because we had these big GDP shocks, but it's kind of bouncing around, but more or less has not trended anymore other than flatlining since 2007. So clearly this extreme kind of phase of, in a sense, my generation of globalization, that I think, seems to have ended. Now, that doesn't mean we won't have globalization, but I think what's happening, the best way perhaps to describe it is we're seeing a rewiring of globalization. And one of the, I think, quite worrying trends, of course, is that this will have a lot of fragmentation, potentially quite a dramatic fragmentation into kind of at least two major blocks. And this could go far beyond trade. You can imagine payment systems, digitalization systems, security arrangements. So you can imagine the world shifting quite dramatically, and perhaps within these blocks you could have more trade and more interlinkages, but much less so between the blocks. And I think this, of course, for global common challenges like climate change, is not a promising development. It's early days, but I think when I see what's happening at the world, this is one of my big worries, that we're seeing a kind of rewiring and a fragmentation of globalization, which will make it much harder to give legitimacy to the United Nations or other international bodies, which will make it much harder to solve global common problems, basically.
So, I mean, if you think about it, actually, globalization as we defined it from the 1980s forward, which is essentially what we've been talking about, has been, as you said very, very clearly, has been, stay kind of like stopping in a sense since, it's to 12 or 15 years where that's really clear that you can see that. So, but this is, this is the history of globalization. You have, when you look at the history of globalization, you have globalization phases and they look very different from each other. So for example, something that is quite striking is that you have in historical periods before World War I, or even to some degree after World War I, you have much more circulation of labor than we have today. So you have, and today obviously the 80s, 90s globalization has been striking by the financial dimension of the globalization has been really very striking. So we have different forms of globalization. So yes, we are, kind of reaching probably, if not an end, at least a moment of calm for this particular kind of globalization. On the other hand, and this is what is worrying, is that indeed, global, the challenges we're facing have never been as global to some degree as they are today. And so how are we going to do in a period where we are retreating to some degree, reorienting ourselves to our nations and or to regions, and still have to face those problems which are totally global. And it's obviously climate change, but it's also very much cybersecurity or digital challenges of different kinds, pandemic, we saw that with the past 2 years, etc. So we have this multiplicity of challenges that have never, so we have a globalization of challenges to some degree. And so
but not the responses?
Well, that's the thing. It's how do we, how do we reinvent a form of architecture?
Is it the end of history?
Oh, it's definitely the end of history, but it's been for some time. I think that's quite clear. Even Fukuyama himself says, oh gosh, I was wrong. So that's very clear. But how do we reinvent a form of architecture that is legitimate, that goes across those widening gaps between the different, with a focus on issues that we are all existentially dependent upon and facing. So that's, I think, for me, the very key challenge for the coming months. I don't think we have more than months. Or
so a new Bretton Woods system.
Well, the Bretton Woods system in some ways captured the then world. And remember, the problem we have is if we
because you have been part of G20, right, Mr. Hildebrand? So if you can tell us this experience.
Well, I think that if we have very big blocks, I mean, it's one thing, as you know, the Soviet Union, at the peak of the Cold War, I think the amount of trade between the US and the Soviet Union was per year was the same trade as today between the US and China per day. So, this was a very different time. If we're talking about a bloc that is very large, including countries like China and India potentially, or that's a very different story. So I think the bad outcome here, longer term, if we really see fragmentation where you have very large chunks of the world economy that are not part of the same, not just the same value system, but also the same system of norms, of approaches to global common problems. I was quite struck, I was doing just actually yesterday on the way up here. If you look at the 35 countries that abstained at the UN vote on Ukraine,
Africa is divided, if I'm not
well,
mistaken.
but the remarkable number is it's half the world's population.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, you can say that isn't particularly meaningful in terms of GDP, but nonetheless, I think it gives you a warning of the kind of world we could inadvertently end up in, which will be, not effective at addressing many of the problems that we have that really are by nature global, and climate change is the most obvious one.
And going back to, because we have 8 minutes left, and going back to the question of sustainability, and especially the new role of business in relation to how business can create value for society, for people and planet. How do you see, you have been discussing a lot the issue of shareholder capitalism. How do you see shareholder capitalism evolving in a landscape of fragmented globalization, if you like?
It's a tough question. I think one of the interesting aspects of what's happened since the beginning of the war is how many companies have pulled out of Russia on a voluntary basis without having been forced to do it by way of government decrees or rules or sanctions. And I think this, now you can argue that this was a relatively low-cost thing to do because the market was limited in many ways, but nonetheless I find it quite remarkable how companies today are, and this is the old stakeholder capitalism concept I think is relevant, how many dynamics flow into underpinning what a company does, or in the worst case, kind of undermining the legitimacy of what a company does. And you could see some of this at work. So I think today when you're a global company, you really have to look at many dimensions in order to maintain what Milton Friedman used to call the license to operate, right? So it's become complicated. And if we move into a world where values get divided, where blocks get established, where we have significant fragmentation with very large blocks on both sides, that's going to become much more difficult. And so you can think of this ultimately as a kind of a tax. It's a cost on production. It's a cost on being globally active. And I think all this kind of tells me that we're rewiring globalization at the moment. And we have to be careful not to let this lead to higher costs, lower output. At the margin, this to me looks inflationary at a time when already we have inflation, significant inflation challenges. So I think there are many reasons out there at the moment to be concerned how this kind of re-globalization or this rewiring of globalization is going to work, and how it's going to impact not just global GDP or sustainability, but also how it impacts the strategy of global companies or of companies who want to be global companies. It's become, the landscape I think will be much more challenging in a way than it has been in a world where global expansion, global activity, being globally present was very much a thing that was accepted and endorsed.
What is on top of your worry list?
At the moment, inflation. In the simple sense that it's not so much I can very well explain why inflation is where it is. I talked about these two supply shocks. The real challenge here is we must not let long-term inflation expectations come undone.
The anchoring.
This is a major achievement since the 70s. That central banks have been able to create a world of essentially price stability where economic agents essentially assume that prices will be stable. I'm simplifying, but that's the story. And that's an incredibly precious good. So if we lose the anchor on long-term inflation expectations, I think from an economic perspective, that would be very concerning. Broadly speaking, of course, I think we should all be very concerned about the geopolitical tensions that we now have as a result of the war in Ukraine and the humanitarian disaster this creates.
Can I go back on
Yes.
stakeholder capitalism?
Yes, I also want
A
to ask
little bit.
one additional.
One more? Okay.
Yeah.
So I just would like to go back on stakeholder capitalism because like globalization, this is a historical concept. So it has had different lives. And if you go back to the 1950s and even 60s to some degree, most of the world was under systems of stakeholder forms of capitalism with in general a strong role for national governments to actually deal with common good issues, which were mostly national. Then we have this kind of concomitant globalization and transformation towards shareholder capitalism, and the two go hand in hand from the 1980s to more or less 10 or 15 years ago. And then 10 years ago, we see the start of the reaffirmation of a new form of stakeholder capitalism, but in a very different context, in a context where firms are very global. Some firms are even more powerful than states, across the planet. And where, again, going back to what I said before, challenges have become, for many of them, the most problematic challenges have become global. So it's very, it's a good news that we are moving back to stakeholder capitalism, that's for sure. But it probably is not enough, because in parallel to that, we have the role of business in society here, in that sense, on the planet to some degree, which is completely necessary in a context where the most planetary actors today are firms to some degree, and the most powerful planetary actors, I should say, today are firms. And so this goes back a bit to the discussion that we were having before, which is that some of this has happened through, through the offsetting of negative externalities, and this has been a big trend over the last years. But the next stage, if we really want to avoid the risks that are being underscored by the latest IPCC report, is really to move from offsetting externalities to a systemic reduction, if not disappearance, of negative externalities, which is a very different ballgame in the sense that it really is about insetting social and environmental responsibilities in the value chains and in our financial instruments, in our financial metrics, etc. And that's something where there is movement, there's quite a fair amount of movement, but that will call for a strong mobilization of many different kinds of actors, obviously financial, economic, political, academic actors. I think everybody needs to be around the table to work in that direction. So, I like to say that we need to transform the growth projection into a prosperity projection, which prosperity including economic growth, but being much more complex in its definition, including by nature, environmental resilience, obviously, but also social stability, because without social stability, we know that the political and geopolitical consequences will have an impact on the capacity of business to do profit at some point or another. So this is really, again, I'm trying to complexify a bit, but I think this is, how do we build on current stakeholder capitalism to take this next step, which is, for me, really the very necessary step.
Mr. Hildebrand, final note. What is the next stage of sustainability for business?
Whether it can harness enough capital, whether we can mobilize enough capital to make the investments that will be needed to accelerate this transition. I'm talking now from a European perspective. This has to happen very, very quickly, right? We do not have a solution right now to replace Russian gas tomorrow. There are things that can be done. Quebec has a huge gas repository. It can't be transported easily. There are new technologies where you can convert ships and containers to transport gas in a kind of high pressurized form, but it's expensive. So I think, this is going to require an enormous mobilization of capital.
Enormous, yes.
And I think we need an alignment of the appropriate policy incentives. And then business has to kind of, be prepared. Think of it this way, no matter how much we use the public balance sheet through a new form of fiscal policy, and the attitudes. I see, Lucas, when we think back to 10 years ago, how we thought about fiscal policy in Europe, things have changed quite dramatically, not least, I think, thanks to Greece in many ways. The German position on fiscal policy has changed quite dramatically. But even if you take the most forward-leaning position on fiscal policy, there's no way you can fund the investments that are needed for the transition from the public balance sheets. It's just too big. So we're going to need to find ways to mobilize large sums of private capital. And I think that's the challenge we face in common, the public and the private sector.
And the kind of new consensus, right?
Yeah.
Social political consensus. Yeah. So we have run out of time.
Perfect timing.
We all appreciate your insights and all the arguments you had a chance to discuss with us at the Delphi Economic Forum. Thank you so much. We're very grateful.
Thank you, Maria.
Thank
we
you.
wish you all the best.
Thank you for having us in Greece.
Thank you.
Thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.